Welcome to Sarah Thornton, the Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner.
Thank you very much, Gary, for that introduction, and I think I will diplomatically sidestep the last point that you've made. I'm really welcome this conference, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak. I read through Gary Craig's report on modern slavery in the Fenland area yesterday, and I'm looking forward to reading Margaret Greenfield's report on the related area of migration, because although we try to think of the two separately sometimes, they are actually very much interrelated. And I think it's particularly important we're thinking about rural areas. And as Gary's report talks about, the way in which sparsity so affects the response. Support networks are much more disparate. I was thinking about all the safe houses I've visited since I've been in this role, safe houses for victims of modern slavery. Sheffield, Manchester, London, they tend to be in cities. That's where the provision is. And also just thinking about the social isolation, which we often hear about, of minority communities in more rural areas. Finding help is just much more difficult. And I met a few Filipino survivors of domestic servitude a few weeks ago in Notting Hill. And one of them was talking about escaping from servitude. She was staying in a 5-star hotel with a family who'd brought her across from Qatar, sleeping on the floor, eating scraps from the table. And she eventually got the opportunity to escape from the hotel room. And she went into the street, and she didn't know where to look until she found a passing Filipino woman who took her home and took her in. And that sense in which in the cities, support is much closer than I think it can be in the rural areas. And it reminded me very much of my time in policing. I don't know, you'll never believe this, but Julie Spence and I, your Lord Lieutenant, were Assistant Chief Constables together 20 years ago. You won't believe that, I'm sure, in the Thames Valley. And you remember, Julie, we used to grapple with issues of sparsity in policing. In the Thames Valley, there were cities and towns like Reading, Oxford, Milton Keynes, but also lots of rural areas. And those issues of sparsity and resourcing was something that we grappled with on a daily basis. And also that sense in a rural area, when something happens, everybody gets to hear about it. That kind of ripple effect, which concerns people and creates fear and sense, I think, of vulnerability. And if I think back to that time, and this is why Rosmini is such a good idea, if I think back to that time, the best ways in which we responded to those were when it was through empowering the community. In policing, we used to do joint patrols with the gamekeepers and the people working on the farms. That was the kind of sense of empowering people and doing joint partnership work in very practical areas. And it's really good to see that Rosmini is very much involved in that partnership and empowerment. I was in Ely on Monday, which I've just checked with David, is not in the Fenlands, but you probably can see the Fenlands from Ely. So I was very close, visiting a mushroom farm for the first time in my life. And the reason why I was there was I was invited by a company which has spent a lot of time trying to prevent modern slavery and human trafficking. Because they know if they're bringing in temporary seasonal workers, that is a high-risk area. So they've done all sorts of things, from directly recruiting in Eastern Europe. They provide accommodation, they provide a social centre and social activities. They have a full approach in terms of a modern slavery strategy. They audit, they analyse data, they have whistleblowing arrangements. And until recently, the last 2 or 3 years, their return rate was about 80%. So it is possible to have temporary migrant workers with employers who actually want to treat people properly. Their average hourly rate was above the living wage for outside London. It was, I think, £9.35. So it is possible, and I wanted to go there to find out best practice. And the one thing, I just apologise to every other speaker, I hate doing this, but this is a flying visit because I promised to go to the Gangmaster and Labour Abuse Authority Board, which is in Nottingham this afternoon, so I've got to leave very hastily to go out to that, but that was a prior commitment. But of course it's interesting, isn't it, that the GLAA, and Paul will be speaking later, the 3 areas that they concentrate on, the high-risk areas of agriculture, horticulture and seafood, are very much rural issues, because we know that they're the high risk and they need to have special attention. my own view, and because, of course, Stephen Barclay is no longer a minister, so he's just a candidate now. But my own view is that the GLAA, it might be better if it was in a single enforcement body, but it needs more resources to do more inspections, I think, because I think that does help. I do believe in greater regulation. So, my slides. For those of you who don't know, my role was established by the Modern Slavery Act, and it's to promote good practice in the prevention, detection, investigation and prosecution of modern slavery offences and the identification of victims. The accountability works through the Secretary of State, through the Home Secretary. I presented my strategic plan to the Home Secretary, who laid it before Parliament last month. And there are specified public authorities that are under duty to cooperate with me. So local police forces, the National Crime Agency, local authorities, Health Service, Border Force. There's a range of organisations that have to cooperate with me. That is my only kind of power. Of course, I have the power of my voice and the power of my reporting, which is very important. So that's my role. What I thought I'd just say a few things about modern slavery and human trafficking at the very beginning, just to think about the scope. Because I think sometimes people think modern slavery is some sort of like esoteric idea, which isn't kind of practically in kind of the real world. It's just, rather exotic flower, as somebody once said to me. Actually, the issues we're grappling with about county lines, invariably those children have been trafficked, which would fulfil every requirement under Section 2 of the Modern Slavery Act. So there's a real interface with a big issue that we're dealing with today. Similarly, in terms of child sexual exploitation and abuse, frequently children are trafficked, again, under the meaning of Section 2 of the Act. So to think of this as something that's kind of out, over there, actually it's absolutely front and centre of what we're dealing with at the moment. And the National Crime Agency, in their report earlier this year, assessed that most modern slavery and human trafficking offending is organised because of the continuous nature of exploitation and the level of capability required to move people, to control people, and to exploit for profit. And it's worth remembering, particularly as I think a lot of the issues we'll be talking about are labour exploitation, that actually this is an economic crime. It's an economic crime where the trade is in human beings. And that's why we're really so concerned about it. And I think just before I go into my strategy, it's worth just saying something about the shocking finding of 39 young people who left Vietnam with the greatest of hopes to provide for their families and ended up in that container in Essex. And just to say that, whether it's smuggling or trafficking, this is about transnational organised crime. And they don't take a view about whether it's smuggling or trafficking. They just maximise their profit as they exploit people in their journeys across the globe. So I think it's really important that, of course, border security matters, but we mustn't think about the response as just about security at the borders and checking more lorries. It has got to be about thinking of this about transnational organised crime. It's got to be about international cooperation, what we can do in upstream in countries of origin like Vietnam, but also what we're doing in this country in terms of law enforcement and those really, really difficult, complicated, complex police investigations which get to the traffickers rather than merely wrongly imprison the victims of trafficking, which is so often the case. And I was reading with interest the Foreign Affairs Select Committee published on Monday that sense they argue that closing the borders drives migrants to take more dangerous routes and pushes them into the hands of smugglers. That was their view. They talked about a fatal gamble. And I think my one plea, thinking about that whole issue, is as we think about global Britain post-Brexit, as we think about the approach to migration, let's not narrowly focus on preventing irregular migration. Let's think about what's in the interest of the United Kingdom in a global world. How do we express soft power through these sorts of things? And more specifically, when we think about new approaches to migration, let's stress test them to ensure that they're not vulnerable to the traffickers. Let's have people at the front and centre of our approach because they are vulnerable if we don't think about it at the very beginning, and they will be exploited. So, to my strategy. 4 priorities: focus on victim care, supporting law enforcement, prevention, and kind of the wraparound, which is I'm a great believer in evaluation and research about actually what are we learning about what works in all those three areas. Really, really important. And so I'll just dance through very quickly what's in the strategy, and then I'm going to just give you a case study at the end. So in terms of victim care, of course it's really important that we identify more victims. 7,000 victims identified through the national referral mechanism last year. My guess is it'll be near to 10,000 this year. It certainly looked like it's going that way in the published statistics. So we are getting better, but my view is that it's just the tip of the iceberg. We need to improve the quality of victim support. I'm really concerned that victims are waiting a long time for those trafficking decisions, and then if they're not members of the European Economic Area, they're waiting a long time for asylum decisions as well. 2, 3, 4 years. So how can the Home Office have promised they're going to speed it up? We need that to be much quicker, because the impact on people's physical and mental well-being of waiting, as somebody said, victims need time, not delay. And there's a very great, and my sense of when I listen to people's stories, that sense of their lives are on hold, they're in limbo. So I'll be kind of watching very carefully and reporting on that. I think we also need to think about long-term about victims. I think sometimes the response is about rescue, look after for a while, and then just drop. How are we helping vulnerable people? What is the role of civil society? What's the role of local authorities and all other public authorities? So let's think about the long term, because we know that quite frequently victims end up being re-trafficked or they end up destitute on the streets. And so I suspect very much under the control of traffickers. And of course, support to child victims is really key. There are some fantastic independent child trafficking guardians, but only a third of the country have got them. Ministers have promised that they were going to roll this out to the rest of the country. Let's see that happening, because we do need people who really understand the system to advocate on behalf of vulnerable children, particularly unaccompanied children. Second priority is about law enforcement. There is no doubt there are more and more crimes being recorded by police forces, about 4,500 last year, which is good, but I'm really concerned about the level of investigation and the ability to turn those investigations into prosecutions. And I've written to all chief constables last month saying, I'm concerned that you're not referring as many cases as you were to the Crown Prosecution Service for either advice or for charging, and I'm getting the responses in from at the moment. So it's really important that we coordinate that whole system and we think about more prosecutions. But it's also important that at every level of law enforcement, whether that's the local or the regional or the national, that people are working together and things are being properly escalated. I was with some former police colleagues yesterday, and they were saying, we still have a problem when crime crosses force borders. And this is, trafficking nearly always crosses force borders, and it is a real challenge. Protecting victims of trafficking, this is this really important issue about, it's called Section 45 of the Modern Slavery Act, but it's based on international obligations, that those who offend as a direct result of their trafficking should not be doubly punished. And we need to make sure that particularly children who are being trafficked are not being doubly punished. A lot of work is going on in that area to make us better at identifying the issue, but really, really tricky and difficult area. And equipping professionals. We've got to train and train and train, because people forget what they're looking for, they forget what to do, and it's really important that whether it's police officers, prosecutors, judges, and I was doing some training in Scotland last week for the Judicial Institute up there, that actually all our professionals in the criminal justice system know what to look for and understand the issues. Focus on prevention. If there are three legs of the stool, prosecution, prevention, and protection, I think on the whole, prevention has been the kind of the shorter leg of the stool. And I think we need emphasis on all three. And I think that's why this sort of work is really important, because actually it helps us all to think about how do we protect, how do we make communities more resilient. So working with the private sector, and I'll explain a little bit about that in a minute, companies with a turnover of more than £36 million a year have to write a modern slavery statement. That needs to be more than just words. You know, it's the spirit of that rather than just the words. Some companies, particularly consumer-facing, are really good. Others, which are business-to-business, not as good. We've got to think about the public sector. Quite a lot of local authorities, health authorities, have started to do their own modern slavery statements. We need to encourage that. And I know that government are currently working on a modern slavery statement for government, which I'm very much in favour of. But it's also about raising public awareness, which I'll come to at the end, and thinking about preventing victimisation. And this goes back to my point about what can we do in countries of origin? What can the whole of government do to invest to make people less vulnerable? And lastly, getting value from research and innovation. I still think we've got an issue about prevalence. We still tend to use the Home Office 10 to 13,000, which is like 6 years old now. We don't like the Global Slavery Index, 136,000. We don't like the methodology. What is the prevalence? I think we need to get a clearer idea on that. I'll be developing lots of partnerships with a range of universities already working on that, working on the research priorities, which the Home Office developed a couple of years ago, and making sure that when government invests in the Policy and Evidence Centre, whether it invests through the research councils, that we really are getting maximum return, and we are bridging from the world of academia into policy and practice. It's not about universities just doing their own thing in ivory towers. It's about what does this mean for policy and practice. I'm going to finish with a case, Operation Fort, which was an investigation in a more rural area of the West Midlands, which took over 5 years, and it culminated in 2 trials, in fact, this year. And the second trial ended in the summer, back in, I think it was July, and it got a lot of publicity. What had happened was that 8 offenders from 2 Polish organised crime groups were convicted of slavery, trafficking and money laundering. The police identified 92 victims of modern slavery, so that's 92 people where they had statements properly identified. They think that probably about 400 victims in total. These were vulnerable people who'd been trafficked from Poland, and they were living in utter squalor. Their bank accounts were under the control of the traffickers, so although they were being paid, they were being allowed to keep maybe £20 a week. What had happened in Poland, they were often vulnerable people who needed money for health care for family members. Some were people with alcohol problems, some were people who were destitute in one way or another. And the traffickers say, we've got a job for you in the UK, it's really well paid, you'll get several £1,000s a month. If you're coming, you need to come today. And it's that kind of like pressure selling. And they come, and then having met one of them, when he suggested to the traffickers that he should go back to Poland, they were quite clear the only way he was going back to Poland was in pieces in the boot of a car. And this was a big guy who clearly believed that threat to be absolutely realistic. So that was Operation Fort. Now, go back to one of my old heroes, Sir Robert Peel, always about prevention. It's, let's not just respond to crime and disorder, let's not respond to modern slavery, let's think about prevention. So this was a great prosecution, good result, took 5 years, very complicated, very complex, brilliant prosecutor in Caroline Hawley. But the companies that these guys were working for, and there were a couple of women as well, were supplying to all the supermarkets via, they were second-tier suppliers to all the supermarkets and all the DIY stores you would ever shop in. So I was thinking about all these companies have all got modern slavery statements. What are they actually doing to respond to this? Because, as I said to them in my letter, this case illustrates the enormous harm and that clearly your business has a role to play, and I asked to be reassured by them. I'm pleased to say all of them responded, probably about half at chief exec level, because I'd written to the chief execs, and I've been doing a range of visits since then with a view really to identifying good practice, which is one of the reasons why I was in Ely on Monday. So what I'm trying to do from that prosecution is kind of go back into prevention and say, what is it that businesses can do to ensure that not only their supply chains, but also their own organisations aren't unwittingly employing people who are enslaved or who have been trafficked to this country. And I think that's really important. And just to end with that point about prevention, because we're all members of the public, I think we're much better at understanding the environmental cost of goods and services, but do we understand the social cost? Do we think about the exploitation that's gone into the clothes we wear, the coffee we've just been drinking, the chocolate, if there was any, all those sorts of things? There are child workers, there's labour exploitation in a lot of those supply chains in other countries. We're often closer to exploitation than any of us would feel comfortable with if we knew. When they do surveys, most people think this is something that happens in the other side of the world. We know from Operation Fort and for Gary's work that actually it can happen in our own country, but we also need to be asking about those global supply chains. And just a couple of thoughts, and I need to be careful on this, but can a dress really cost £20? And the responsible car wash people would say, can a car wash cost £6.70? In fact, I think they might have revised up their estimate at which point, below which point they're saying you've got people who are in situations of exploitation. So I think that's for all of us to be asking those questions, because we all as consumers help to create the market in which exploitation, slavery and trafficking can flourish. Thank you very much.